This is the Comics Alternative Eurocomics, reviews of The Initiates and Satania. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Eurocomics. I'm Derek.
And I am Pascal, and we are two guys with advanced degrees discussing Eurocomics, comics in translations.
That's right. And on the March Eurocomics episode, Pascal and I are going to discuss two books that have come out from NBM. We're going to begin with Étienne Davodeau's The Initiates, a comic artist and a wine artisan exchange jobs. And then we're going to look at Fabien Vehlmann and Kerascoët's Satania. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Eurocomics is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
For example, you can find other titles by the same creative team as Satania, by Fabien Vehlmann and Kerascoët. Their book Beautiful Darkness in hardcover is available in a drawn and quarterly section. You can also find other books published by NBM, such as Sartre, the biography, hardcover as well. And this one is by Ramadier and Despommiers. And a new title called Garden of Secrets by Niki de Saint-Phal. That looks very interesting as well. Mm-hmm. All that in Discount Comic Book Service.
That's right. Yeah, they have great books from the publisher NBM, as well as many others in translation. You can't go wrong with the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Please be sure to go to their website, dcbservice.com. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your books in translation there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Pascal and Derek sent you. Well, Pascal, people who regularly listen to the Eurocomic series are wondering, what's going on? There's something new here. Edward sounds a little different, and now he's going by a different name. It's not a mistake. We or actually, this is the first show, Pascal, that you are co-hosting with me.
That's correct.
The reason for that, and this will be what we'll be doing for almost the remainder of this year. Edward, as listeners of the series know, has had his hands full, especially with his newborn back in the fall. In addition to that, he's also, his work responsibilities, he's also trying to finish up his dissertation, so we wish him definitely well on that endeavor. And so he has needed to take a break from the podcast at least until October, and then we'll see how things stand. But when Edward said that he needed to step down and take a break and focus on family and work in his dissertation, I thought, okay, who am I going to get to fill in while Edward is away? And my first thought was Pascal Hamon. And Pascal, and you can go into more detail about this, but I will say that my experience with you is notable because you were, to my memory, the first regular listener of the podcast to correspond with us. I mean, I remember seeing your name in emails from the very beginning. And it's not as if we emailed back and forth about every week or even every other week, but occasionally you would contact us either via email, sometimes via Twitter. And so you would keep in touch. And then several years ago, I had the pleasure of meeting you at Small Press Expo. I remember Andy Wolverton and I were sitting outside of the hall waiting for it to open up so we could go in.
And I came in.
this guy with a French accent and longer hair came up and introduced himself, and he said, "We've corresponded. My name is Pascal Hamon." I said, "Oh my God!" And so we met in person, and we've gotten together at other cons since then, and have hung out and have talked quite a bit about comics. So again, it was kind of a no-brainer for me to turn to you, and I'm glad that you said yes, that you would help with the co-hosting duties of the monthly Eurocomic series.
Well, thank you, Derek, for inviting me. And I have to say I've enjoyed your discussions with, all of the team, and especially with Edward, who was, I think, doing an amazing job talking about Eurocomics and, comics in translation. And I loved his perspective on being a translator himself, because as a bilingual person, it's a very it's a thing that's dear to my heart. That relationship between English and French, it has kind of shaped my life, and comics have shaped my life as well. So it's kind of a meeting of the two things. So thank you for having me on. I'm going to try to do as good a job as Edward. And yes, like you mentioned, I think the first show I listened was about Darwin Cook, because I'm a big Darwin Cook fan.
Oh wow, that was a really early one.
I think it was the number 2 or something like that.
Yeah, episode 2 or 3, something to that effect. Yeah.
I can't say I've listened to all of them because your output is phenomenal, but I've tried my best to listen to all sorts of shows, and I actually have discovered a lot of new artists thanks to you guys. So thank you for that. Mm-hmm. Now, a little bit about myself. Like you said, there's an accent going on. It is not too bad. I'm not going to do it that way because it is horrendous when I try to do, the horrible French accent. I hate it, so I try to work on it. But yes, I was born in France in a city called Nantes on the west coast. And I don't know exactly how it happened, but when I was 3 years old, somebody gave me Asterix books, it was Asterix and Cleopatra. And then I just completely fell in love with it. And I actually read most of Asterix and Tintin or Tintin before I could read. So I read the pictures and I made up stories. And then later on, when I learned how to read, some of those books actually disappointed me because my stories were actually better. But so I was very attracted by the visual aspect of comics from the get-go, and then going to the balloons and reading the text when I could do that. So really, that blend of picture and language have really been central for me throughout my life. And I made a big announcement to my parents that I would become a cartoonist. That didn't really happen because I also became very interested in learning English. I was exposed to English also very early. My parents took me to England quite regularly, and I met people there and actually also discovered British comics that were interesting. And then later on, I dabble a little bit, and I did some self-publishing with friends about 20 years ago now. It was a long time ago. But we put out this anthology. So I wrote and drew a bunch of pages, and that was a lot of fun. And most of my friends now are doing that professionally in France. But I moved to the US and I pursued a different career. And now I'm working at Missouri State University, where I work with their ESL program. So I teach English as a second language. So English is still there. But I think learning English also kind of opened up my the availability of all those books that, there were a lot of stuff was translated in France, so I could read them in French. But for example, reading Crazy Cat in the original language, there's nothing like it, right? If you compare, even the best French translation is never going to match what the this language is like in the book in particular. So I think it's going to be interesting. I've been reading, of course, books published in Europe for a long time, so I have some background information that might be interesting to the show. And I'm always interested in reading books in translation, so I can, maybe I'm not as professional as Edward in this area, but I can nitpick translations sometimes, and that's kind of an interesting hobby I have too.
That's interesting because you use the word nitpick. One of the things that I recall Edward saying about himself on the show a number of times is he would make a comment, but he says, maybe this is nitpicking as a translator, and then he'd go off on whatever it was that he had an issue with. Don't feel that you have to fill his shoes as a translator. Although feel free to make whatever comments if we're reading a Franco-Belgian text, let's say, as we are today on this episode. Both of them that we're looking at were originally published in French. And by the way, we should say we did not plan that as a way of bringing you, Pascal, on the show. Edward and I were already going to do an NBM episode looking at the initiates and Satania. It just happened that with the fill-in for Edward happened to be French or a French origin. So
that's correct.
But you mentioned your experience growing up in France, but also your love of graphic albums and European comics. That is a cultural experience that you can bring to this series that I obviously cannot. I feel that, to some degree with the manga show and also with the Eurocomic series, I bring a perspective that in many ways is an outsider perspective. I'm fascinated by the different texts from different cultures that I'm not really aware of in a full sense. And so there's a lot surrounding the text itself, and not just the language, but the cultural issues, sometimes the politics and what have you, that the text could be concerned with either directly or indirectly that I may not get. I may not know the history. I may not know the particular cultural reference. And so anytime over these next several months that we're discussing a text that you have additional knowledge or experience of, by all means, jump in and educate me, because you are an educator. Well,
thank you. Yeah, I'll definitely focus on those kind of a cultural context if I have, information. And also the publishing context, because I kind of, especially books that I've seen published in France, I know I kind of see where they fit in the publishing industry in France, and in terms of their reception or availability, things like that. And it's interesting that we're going to discuss the initiates as the first title, because this is almost like, it feels almost like the French, what do I want to say? What word do I want to use here? Maybe the heart of French culture, right? It's wine and bande dessinée, right? Comics brought together. So
that's right.
It's and I have disclaimer though, I do not drink wine. I have no knowledge of wine tasting, so do not ask me about anything about that. But that makes the book precious to me. The only experience I have is I've been to, the vineyards and met the winemakers. But people always ask me all sorts of questions about wine, like what should I drink with this, and I
just assume because you're French that of course
exactly
you would know
yes
about wine. Yeah,
you should know that. And I always tell people as a joke that that's the reason I live in the States. I was actually deported from France because I don't drink any wine, so they sent me to the States.
When I said earlier that, feel free to educate me on some of the social, political, cultural, publishing context that may surround some of the text that we discussed, by no means was I asking you to talk only about that.
Of course not.
But I will ask you this and kind of demand it in a friendly way.
Sure.
Please correct my French.
Oh, okay.
Don't feel bad about it because I mispronounce things often, I feel. And I don't think Edward corrects me much, but as long as you don't say, "You idiot," that's not how you pronounce the name. Gently educate me, I guess.
All right. I'll use the same strategies I use with my students. And, the same goes for English words. Like sometimes in the middle of, I'm talking and I may mess up a word. I may mess up a stress or something. So feel free to tell me, what was that? Like, yeah, in Initiate, they, for some odd reason, and that's a translation thing, they use a weird word. For a winemaker, they use the word vintner, which is not super common, I think. Do you feel that it's a common word?
It's not a common word. I didn't really notice that or think that was, I noticed the word. I didn't think that it was problematic because, I'm aware what it means, but you're right. That is a word that maybe many readers may not encounter on a regular basis. So, as you can see, here we are, we're kind of anticipating some of the things that we're going to be bringing up in a few moments when we do get to Davodeau's, the Initiates.
Correct.
And I want to get to that place, but Pascal, welcome to the show. I really do look forward to talking with you about these texts for this month, these NBM books, as well as other books that we decide to discuss in future episodes.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get to this month's discussions, though, now that you've introduced yourself, I want to introduce some listener mail, or at least correspondence, that we have received since last month's show.
Okay.
Mail time. Mail time.
Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
And what our old friend Mailbox has this time around is yet another message that someone left us on YouTube. I've been saying this quite a bit lately. We do get emails, we do get tweets, we get messages on Facebook. It seems, though, that proportionately speaking, we get more responses on our YouTube channel than we do via other means combined, I think. Especially for the relatively low number of subscribers, I think at least, that we have on our YouTube channel. So I really do appreciate any comments that people send, not just on YouTube, but, email, Twitter, Facebook, social media in general. But this message comes from Jean-Baptiste Grenouille. And again, this is where you can help me with the pronunciation. Grenouille.
Oh, Jean-Baptiste Grenouille.
Grenouille.
Yeah.
Jean-Baptiste Grenouille writes on YouTube, he's commenting on our show from back last summer where Edward and I looked at a variety of Valerian and Laureline titles.
Yes.
And if you remember on that episode, we mentioned that Laureline doesn't seem to be that sexualized. Every now and again, she is to a point, but at least not to any degree of cheesecake, let's say.
Yes.
Now, Jean-Baptiste says she is sexualized a little bit here and there. And I'm reading this message, changing into cute or sexy outfits, but it's indeed done very subtly, tastefully, in that the artist doesn't indulge and overall not much attention is given to it. This makes it all the more effective. She's actually butt naked in a panel in Volume 5, or 6 if you count Volume 0. I think you could say she's sensualized, but not hyper-sexualized. Laureline knows she's a pretty young girl and enjoys it and enjoys dressing up into unique outfits. But it's done so sparingly and subtly throughout the volumes and panels that to comic standards and current TV standards, it's very tame. The focus is on the character. You're much more likely to fall a little bit in love with Laureline than to get a hard-on, which is very well done, especially in a series that doesn't pay much attention to psychological depth, etc. Jean-Baptiste, thank you. I mean, that's a very good comment. Yeah, we appreciate that.
And I totally agree. I think it's a well put comment. And I remember as a young teenager, when you read a Valerian book, you know, in the back of your mind, it's like, there's going to be a Laureline scene somewhere. It's going to be a panel. So that's true.
Yes. We do appreciate the comments, so keep them coming, whether they're on YouTube, Twitter, email, what have you. Get in touch with us because it helps to create a community, and we like to know what our listeners think. Okay, Pascal, let's get into the heart of this month's episode. We're going to be looking at only NBM titles, and we're looking at two relatively recent NBM titles. NBM is a publisher that we've discussed quite a number of times on the Comics Alternative in general. In fact, on last week's regular review episode, Gene and I reviewed The True Death of Billy the Kid, which is also a recent NBM book. But we definitely talk about NBM titles on the Eurocomic series because they do a lot of works in translation. And two that we're going to be looking at this month is Étienne Davodeau's The Initiates, a comic artist, and a Wine Artisan Exchange Jobs. And then after that, we're going to look at Satania by Fabien Vehlmann and Kerascoët. First, The Initiates. Now, you were familiar with Davodeau's work before The Initiates, correct?
Yes. Davodeau came on the scene in France in the early 90s. So I started reading him maybe in 95, 97. And he was doing fairly realistic fiction work, very character-centered, very well written. And but in 2001, he put out a book that is not actually, I think, available in English, called Rural, exclamation mark, which was his first nonfiction work. And it was kind of groundbreaking at the time. He had a friend who had an organic farm, and who actually was a farmer and switched to organic farming. And he kind of documented that process with his book. And that was a major hit in France, and it brought a lot of readers that usually don't read comics. And that's one of Davodeau's really focus, is to create books that will attract any kind of reader beyond the usual readership of comics, and kind of putting together worlds that do not usually intersect. So that one, The Initiate's almost like a continuation of what he did in Rural, in a way, focusing on winemaking, but same principle.
As you were describing Rural, I couldn't help but think that you could use the same words and phrases to describe The Initiates. Mm-hmm. This is the very first time that I've read Davodeau. Now, I'm aware of his other books by NBM that have been translated. I remember when Lulu Anew was solicited in, I think it was 2015, is when NBM published that translation. And then last year, they published, as part of their Louvre collection, Davodeau's The Cross-Eyed Mutt.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Now, am I wrong in thinking that The Cross-Eyed Mutt, Lulu Anew, and now The Initiates, these are his only three works translated into English?
To my knowledge, yes.
Yes.
At this point,
Now, The Initiates originally came out from NBM. It was the first Davodeau book that they published. The hardcover edition of The Initiates came out in March of 2013, and I think you originally got the book at around that time, correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, the reason why we're reviewing this now as a recent book is because the very beginning of March of this year is when NBM chose to release a paperback edition of The Initiates.
Yeah, I think the hardcover was pretty successful. I think they mentioned it was out of print, at least on NBM side. So that's probably a good sign.
So now they have a paperback and, for many, a more affordable edition of The Initiates. Now, the subtitle of this book, and maybe we can start here, and I want to get your take on this. The subtitle is A Comic Artist and a Wine Artisan Exchange Jobs. That's not entirely accurate, though.
It is not. And it is, well, let me make just a note about the title. A very interesting translation choice.
Okay.
The Initiates, the French title is The Ignorance. So it's a complete flip. Now, I think the title, The Initiates, maybe being more positive, was something they wanted to go for. And I don't think it's a mistake or anything like that. But the subtitle of the French edition is the story of an initiation, like what's the word I want? Not retrospective. Shoot, I can't remember the word now.
Initiation makes sense, though.
Yeah, but both ways. Reciprocal initiation. The story of a reciprocal initiation. That's the title. The subtitle in France. So I think they focused on that initiation idea and put it as the big title in English, maybe to be more positive.
Okay.
So
yeah, I'm looking at the title page here. And by the way, we should mention, I forgot to mention this, that the translator of this English edition is Joe Johnson.
Correct.
The original title is, and Pascal, don't laugh too hard, Les Ignorants, Récit d'une Initiation Croisée. Is that
not
correct?
bad?
Not
yes.
bad. Okay. So you're saying that the English translation of the title is a little more positive?
Well, when you say The Initiates, it's like, right, it focuses on the end product. They both learn about each other. The French focus of the title is focusing on the beginning of the story when they don't know each other, about each other's jobs, right? They are ignorant, like the cartoonist is ignorant about the winemaker's job, and winemaker is ignorant about the cartoonist's job. So it seems it's a different focus. And maybe NBM didn't want to have a book called The Ignorance. I don't know. But it's certainly striking in France. When you see the book and say Les Ignorants, it sounds like what? It's negative. It sounds negative. So maybe.
And the reason why I wanted to start with the title, or at least the subtitle, The Initiates, I didn't really think much about that as kind of a determining factor of how I was approaching this book. But the subtitle, I did. Again, the subtitle of the English translation is A Comic Artist and a Wine Artisan Exchange Jobs. I was expecting that Davodeau and his friend, who's the winemaker, and his
Richard.
name...
Richard.
Yeah, Richard Leroy. Is that how you pronounce his last name?
Richard Leroy, yes.
Yeah. Now, English speakers may say Richard Leroy. And, if he were American, he would be Richard Leroy.
Yes, I don't think he would like it. Yeah, I don't think... Seeing his attitude in the book, he's very French. Probably would go like, that's not my name.
Yeah, I want to talk about his attitude, because I think that Davodeau does a great job of handling and getting his character across, at least from what I can tell.
Yeah.
But I was expecting that Davodeau would become, at least to some degree, a winemaker, which in the narrative he does to some degree. Yes. And on the other hand, Richard would start making comics, or at least help Davodeau with his comics in some way. But he doesn't. The case with Richard Leroy is that he more or less observes.
Correct.
And he reads books that Étienne gives him.
There's a very, very small contribution. Did you see it? It's at the very, very end of the book. It's after the list of wines and books they've read.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Richard Leroy has that illustration. I'd forgotten about that.
Yeah, he does a little sketch of himself with Davodeau, right? But that's the only contribution in terms of art.
So I guess he, to some degree, did become an artist.
A little bit. But I think the title is meant, the subtitle of the English edition is meant to be catchy, maybe.
Yeah.
But it's true that it is not exactly accurate. And I don't know if we want to talk about the balance of the book in terms of, is it more about winemaking or more about making comics? I mean, what's your idea?
Topic. I wanted us to bring that up. You wanted my take on it?
Yes.
Okay. I think that this book is much more about winemaking than it is comics.
And that's my impression too, as I was reading. And I actually did a little page count, and it's about 70% about winemaking, 30% about comics. And to me, it doesn't make the book a failure or anything like this. I think it's an excellent book. But it maybe because it is Davodeau's kind of project. He's bringing that to Richard, right? He's the one initiating this project. So we can also say that the actual book, the finalized book, it's a comic book. Mm-hmm. So it's like 100%, right? In a way.
Right.
But in terms of audience, I don't know if somebody who doesn't know anything about comics would get as much as somebody who doesn't know anything about winemaking.
I think that those are great observations. And I thought the same thing as you did in terms of its, if we want to call it, lopsidedness. I agree. I don't think it detracts from the book at all. But it made sense to me that there would be more about winemaking than about comics for this reason. The one who is ignorant, I guess, is the artist. And so he is going to write about and illustrate his experiences. And what are his experiences, or at least the more the unique experiences with winemaking? Okay, so it's what he learns. And so you could say that this book is about both Étienne Davodeau and Richard Leroy. But in many ways, this book is about, when it comes right down to it, Davodeau and his experiences as they are filtered through, or at least introduced and framed by his friend Richard when it comes to the winemaking. So that's why there's so much in terms of the winemaking. Another reason why I think that this is, and I didn't know it was 70 to 30%. That's interesting. I'm glad you did that page count. That there is so much of an emphasis on winemaking at the expense of comics is because that tells us something about their personalities. And you can tell me if you felt this way or not, but the character of Étienne in this book, because, and we can distinguish between the character Étienne Davodeau and the author/artist Étienne Davodeau. So maybe we can refer to the character as Étienne and then the artist-author as Davodeau. So the character Étienne is someone who, perhaps like the artist Davodeau, is interested in other experiences that he could possibly use for his art. And he's open to understanding people on their own terms, where they're coming from, where their own interests lie. With Richard, on the other hand, his personality clearly comes out, it seems to me, in this book. He is someone who, I won't say is single-minded, especially when it comes to winemaking, but everything seems to come back to winemaking. I mean, there are those moments, and they're not that frequent, but there are moments where Richard gets lost in the art or learning about the comics industry in France. But that's not often. Many times, even when he's out with Étienne at a printer or at Étienne's publisher, it comes back to wine. And so they'll start talking about comics, and then Richard will mention something about the bottles that he's brought people. And he'll start talking about his kind of wine and what other kind of wines. They go out to a restaurant. It's all about the wine. So he brings things back to what Richard, is familiar with. And again, there's nothing wrong with that.
That is that.
As opposed to Étienne, who is interested in other experiences besides his own. And so that's why we have much more about winemaking, because he's interested in what his friend does.
True. I think it's also connected to the nature of their occupation, right? Like, it seems that as a winemaker, it's a it's a huge task. And I think the book is very successful in showing us what hard work it is. And it takes hours and, the cycle of the seasons. And it is not easy to do this. And he seems to be doing it with a very small number of people helping him. And he's got this knowledge and this skills that he's applying year after year to reach, to make his wine the best he can. Mm-hmm. But Davodeau needs content for what he does, right? He's more, I think that's why he needs to be open to the world so he can pour in to his books. And I think that's a big, something that he's really interested in. And he doesn't like to be called a journalist. He doesn't believe he's a journalist. He just says, I'm just a guy who wants to learn things, and experience them and then put them into book form. But yeah, you're right. It is a little different. And I think the way Richard is so connected to the place where he works and the land and the activity of winemaking also maybe keeps him from. I'm not saying that he's close-minded, but he has a more difficulty getting into things that are very foreign, maybe, to his experience.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you linked that to Richard's work as a winemaker, because one of the things that the character Richard tells Étienne time and again is he likes to keep things on a small scale, not because he doesn't want to put in the work, but because he doesn't want to compromise the quality of what he does. Mm-hmm. And Richard has said multiple times in this text that he's afraid that if he attempted, and he even at one point even mentioned he tried to have a really big harvest one year and it didn't turn out as well as he had wanted. But he's okay with having let's say, for instance, a smaller parcel of land for his vineyard.
Yes. With
not putting out as many bottles of wine and having more of an intimate relationship with his product. And I think that explains, I think, part of, again, if we want to call it this, I don't know if it's the best word, his single-mindedness when it comes to winemaking. But it also, I think, is a way for Davodeau to make those connections. And he doesn't hit us over the head with these connections. The similarities between what Davodeau does or Étienne does as a comics creator and what Richard does as a vintner. So the care, the connection to your product, some of the people that you work with in other parts of the industry. I think that Davodeau does a wonderful job of making those connections and showing the similarities between Étienne and Richard without really beating us over the head with it. Said, see, being a comics artist is like a winemaker in this way, or being a winemaker is very much, he doesn't come out overtly and mention this, but the way that the jobs are described, and especially given Richard's character, I think that Davodeau brings that out quite nicely.
Yeah, that's true. I'm thinking about the scene at the printer.
Mm-hmm. Oh, close to the beginning of the book.
Yes. That's definitely where Richard tells him, does your publisher tell you what colors to use? I don't know. and then going through the printing process and seeing how rigorous and careful they are about it, and how Davodeau is checking every single page to make sure his work is reproduced, in the way that he wants. And I think Richard respects that and has the same level of, attention to detail and being very careful about your craft. So I like this part specifically because actually it shows us something about the job of, being a cartoonist that you don't see portrayed in comics very often, right? Same thing for the meeting at the publisher. Well, you have seen that before, but it's not done in that way, I guess.
Yeah, so I thought that was publisher is what? Futuro.
Futuropolis, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, there's that. And, I'm interested that you used the word journalist in describing Davodeau, because I didn't really think of him as a journalist, but when you say journalist in comics, of course, the name Joe Sacco immediately comes to mind, and for good reason. And now that I think about it, what Davodeau does in The Initiates is quite similar to what Joe Sacco does in his comics reportage.
It is, there is definitely a connection there in terms of he portrays himself. Sometimes we see him sketching and interviewing people, and he's there. Like Joe Sacco draws himself in the book, right?
Right. The self asking questions, learning about someone's experience, and that's what Davodeau does in The Initiates. Yes,
and I think he doesn't want to be called a journalist. He actually made a book recently, a couple years ago, where he's working with a journalist. It was about, because it's a historical. It's about the politics, French politics in the 50s and 60s, and de Gaulle, that period when de Gaulle was in power. There was a lot of issues with different underground groups who are trying to take out the president and things like that. But he specifically said, I couldn't do what this journalist does in terms of interviewing people to collect information. He feels like he's more of experiencing the job and making us kind of learning about it. He's more into learning, I think.
Right.
Learning a craft or a skill. And another idea, another thing that I think makes sense as well is when Davodeau came on the scene in France, it was right at the beginning of L'Association, that publisher where Louis Trondheim, Jean-Claude Menu, all those guys that came on, and they were the people who published Persepolis, and it was the first big foray into autobiography. And when you look at Persepolis, it is Marjane Satrapi's story, right? Is it journalism or is it autobiography, right? It's kind of, you learn a lot about Iran, about her experience. And I feel like Davodeau was kind of, he came in a way from that. It's not really a tradition, but it started a few years before. And when he presented Rural to his publisher, Delcourt, who was more of a mainstream publisher, the publisher was actually didn't know what to do with his book. They were like, we don't know how to publish this, and they took the plunge and they tried, and it was very successful. And then it opened up even more venues for nonfiction comics in France. And they actually have an expression that Davodeau uses. He calls them bande dessinée du réel. So literally it's comics of reality, of the real. And it's a genre. And now in France there is actually a magazine called Revue Dessinée, the drawn magazine, which is journalism in comic book form. And Davodeau actually has done short stories and things for that magazine. So it's kind of interesting to see how, in my understanding, it came from the autobio revolution, that happened also in the US, and then kind of evolved. But of course, Joe Sacco was there before, but I think he was kind of the only guy doing that in the 80s, right? Late 80s.
Right.
He was really kind of a weirdo. Nobody else was doing that at the time, but of course now you have a lot of them, but...
Now, we mentioned that there's much more about winemaking than there is about comics creation in the initiates. On the other hand, we do see other vintners in the initiates,
Yes.
but they're very much background characters. But with comics creators, we actually get individuals who make an appearance. And so it's like a walk-in bit, right? They come into the narrative, and these are friends of Davodeau's. So for instance, toward the beginning of the book, and then later on, in the last half, we see Jean-Pierre Gebrat, whom we've discussed on the Eurocomic series in the past. And there's a chapter that's mostly devoted to him. And then toward the end of the book, there is another chapter that focuses primarily on another famous French comics creator, Emmanuel Guibert.
Yeah, Guibert.
Guibert, so it's the harder G. Okay, so Guibert. Which many listeners may know, at least English readers, Alan's War, which I think First Second put out several years ago.
Yes.
And then they put out another Guibert work a couple years ago. I can't remember. It was the follow-up to Alan's War.
And also The Photographer came out.
Oh, The Photographer, yes.
First Second, yeah.
Yes, that's how people probably will know either Alan's War or The Photographer. And in fact, both of them are mentioned in the initiates, but it's primarily The Photographer that brings Guibert into the story because, if I remember correctly, Richard is quite taken by The Photographer.
Yes. And they go meet the actual journalists.
Right.
Yeah, we did the piece, later on in the book.
Yeah. But there's another prominent French creator that makes an appearance, I guess an appearance especially through the art, and that is Louis Trondheim.
Yes, it's kind of an interesting, and I'm not surprised that Trondheim would respond that way in a comic instead of appearing himself. He's kind of an odd bird,
so to speak. Yeah.
Definitely.
And, I'm sure pun intended. But,
yes.
This takes place in chapter 4,
yes,
which is titled "The Art of the Portrait and Its Vicissitudes," or "The Theory of the Beak," and then that is the Trondheim reference. And where Trondheim comes up, and this is a relatively short chapter, is again one of the books that Étienne gives Richard to read to understand comics or the diversity of comics is something by Trondheim. And for readers of Trondheim's work, especially when he refers to himself, he draws himself as a bird figure with a beak. And Richard tells Étienne, the day after he read that book that evening, that he didn't really like that style. And he's much more of a realist. So why would someone represent himself as a bird? And so that's where we get the theory of the beak. And I'm looking at page 55, and at that very last panel, Étienne basically gives Trondheim permission to enter the narrative. He says, because Richard's wondering, why would someone do this? And so as an answer, Étienne says, "Go ahead, Louis, answer." And then on the next page, on 56, we get Trondheim drawn, his autobiographical visual representation, a bird figure. He says, "Out of the tens of thousands of winemakers and hundreds of millions of bottles, how to distinguish oneself? The soil, certainly. The fermentation, yes. The work, necessarily. Talent, too." And he goes on and on about that. He said, "So I got something irrefutable. I choose the beak." Yes. Besides, it's faster and easier to draw than a real nose with nostrils and all. Which is interesting. One, because it's funny. Two, obviously, because this is where Davodeau gives Trondheim an occasion to step in with his art, the text. But also, it does something that Davodeau is attempting to do throughout, and that is to point out links and similarities between winemaking and comics creation. And so that's one of the things that Trondheim is trying to do as well. He says, well, you try to distinguish yourself as a winemaker through various means. As a comics creator, I choose to do so by representing myself as a bird.
Exactly. Very clever. And the comment that he makes that it's easier to draw It's typical Trondheim, I think. Finding his artwork is really a means to tell stories. It's not meant to be a beautiful piece of work. It's just there to get the story. It's a code. It's more like a handwriting than wanting to make pretty pictures. Mm-hmm. So it has to be, and it is so prolific. It has to be very efficient, very to the point. So that's kind of interesting.
There's another part of this text that I find interesting, and I want to get your take on, Pascal, because it strikes me that Davodeau could have gone further with this, but stopped short. Maybe strategically. I was curious, though, how he may have followed up on this. This occurs in chapter 14. Mm-hmm. It's called Label Drinkers, the chapter title. And in particular, I'm looking at the last page of that chapter, which is 195. This is when Étienne takes Richard to a comics festival. And it's also the occasion where Gibrat makes a reappearance, right? Because he's at the same festival.
Yes.
And, Richard's having a good time. He's met his friend, or as he calls him, his buddy, Gibrat. Uh-huh. And there is another artist that is currently, I guess, having lunch with Étienne and Richard, and also wine. And when Richard goes off with Gibrat, then his friend, the artist friend of Étienne, says, "Your buddy's discovering mostly the good parts of the comics world. Mm-hmm. He's going to think we live in some la-la land. Have you talked to him about people waiting months for a publisher's response? Have you explained to him how it's often difficult to live off your books?" And then the voiceover, I guess, Davodeau's is, "In your opinion?" ? And that's how that chapter ends. And I couldn't help but think, the side of the comics world or the BD world that Étienne is introducing Richard to some degree is sanitized, right? Mm-hmm. Étienne experiences literally the dirt, getting his hands in the grub, even the sweat and the unpleasantness of winemaking, but also, the benefits of it as well, the pleasurable parts, the payoff and all of that. But what Richard sees of comics is rather limited. And so I'm wondering how Étienne or Davodeau would respond to his friend's question. What would it be like if you told him about the less attractive side of comics, the more discouraging side? But neither Richard nor us as readers get that part.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know if he's trying to bring a positive outlook, and it's also looking only at works that have already been published. It's like the end product that he shows. There's a little bit about the process, but it's very late in the the comic making process. It doesn't even talk to him about how you write a script or how you lay out those techniques. He doesn't really talk to him about that, or the struggle that it is to put a book together and get it accepted by a publisher. Definitely is not in there. So yeah, that's a good point. And maybe it's what I got from. So I met Davodeau at TCAF in Canada a couple of years ago when he was Lulu Anu came out. He is a very nice guy. He's very positive, and I think maybe it's not his personality to go there in some way. I even asked him a question about a related topic, because there's a crisis right now in France with there's basically too many books that are published, and the print runs are really low, and the number of books, the shelf life of a book is so short because there is too many books come out, and that is at the expense of a lot of cartoonists that just cannot make a living because their books now, if you print 3,000, that's kind of the norm, and it's not enough. You never get any royalties or anything on those. so there's definitely a problem there. And I told him, the question I asked him was, currently it seems that in the States and in North America, it's booming. Graphic novels are, it's the big thing, and the numbers are going up, and people are very excited about it, and it becomes, it's becoming more mainstream, etc. And in France, it seems that it's not so positive, that there are problems. And he said yes. He said yes, there are issues, and he talked a little bit about it, but he was not very. That was not really, my question didn't really make him happy or anything. He didn't jump on it, So maybe
he didn't use it as an opportunity to gripe.
No, definitely not. I don't think it's his MO to do that. And do you feel like reading this book? You're right. We get the physical nature of being a winemaker and the difficulties that are associated with the job, but they don't go into some of the problems as well. A little bit, but not too much in detail. There is the debate over using sulfur or not, right?
Right.
At one point,
biodynamics,
yes,
organic. Winemaking,
because there are definitely aspects of the wine industry in France that are very problematic in terms of the usage of pesticides, chemicals, the whole system of the name, like the appellation, we call that. Like, how do you decide what your wine? The way you name a wine, it's regulated. It's a very complicated system that is a big problem for some small winemakers, that they are barred from using certain names or appellations because of those rules that were meant to protect winemakers, but now are creating more problems. So there are issues in that industry that maybe touches on the book a little bit, but not too much, right?
So you're saying that this may be a function of Davodeau's more upbeat or optimistic worldview from at least your perspective. Not only do we not see the more downer side of comics creation, but we really don't get an up-close and personal perspective on problems within the winemaking industry. Yeah,
and maybe that's not his topic. I think maybe because he wanted to be open and being in this learning experience, so he maybe has a more positive outlook on things. But you're right but he still includes the comment by the Nico B, right, is the author who says that. So he doesn't ignore it completely.
One at the convention?
Yes. So it's
festival?
He took the time to draw these 3 panels and portray. Maybe that's because this particular author is always talking about that. And I know French authors, when they get together, they tend to talk about those problems a lot. That's the number one topic, So it makes sense to me that it's brought up at least one time.
Yeah, and it's almost as if Davodeau presents this issue, but intentionally doesn't follow up with it. Again, that last panel is, his voiceover words. And voiceover to distinguish Étienne, the character's comments, from Davodeau, the artist, who is basically narrating this experience. And so those last words, in your opinion, ? We see their, Davodeau and Richard's vehicle driving off after the festival. And so it's almost as if Davodeau is inviting us to do what you and I right now are doing, Pascal, is to entertain that possibility that all may not be as rosy as we're reading right here, because you do have potential problems or downsides or the less attractive side of comics creation as well as, by association, winemaking.
True.
Yeah.
It makes us kind of think about it more. I really also want to make a comment about Davodeau's artwork, with I think is very it's very alive, and it's simple, but I think it conveys attitudes and the the body language of characters and the way they interact visually, I think brings a lot to making this reading experience, I think even more realistic and personal.
Yeah, and we haven't really talked much about his style, but he does have a more realistic way of representing characters, settings, objects. At the same time, there is something a little iconic, I don't want to say cartoony, or maybe more minimalist about his art style. So it's not highly detailed, and is I guess this is in ink wash, right? So
yes,
it's grays, and so we have ink wash here. So we do get a variety of different, let's say, visual textures and combinations here. But the art is not highly detailed.
That's true, but I think
much of the time.
Yeah, and I think that allows him to cover so much ground, right? Mm-hmm. And it never gets too there's enough detail so we understand what's going on, but it never gets too static or illustrative, right? Like I was thinking about a book that you guys talked about, the Ichi-F manga about Fukushima, which is also very, very, very documented, but it is very static in its, level of detail. It's a very, very, very detailed, but it becomes a little stiff. And I think in terms of reading experience, the Davodeau flows much better in terms of it's not overwhelming, and especially because this is a book designed for people who do not read comics, right? That's what he wants. He wants readers that have no experience of comics. So I think it's a perfect style for that. It's not overwhelming, and it flows very well.
Yeah, and again, sticking with the topic of Davodeau's style, I'd mentioned that it's not highly detailed. On the other hand, it's detailed enough to where he does carefully represent characters in such a way that you really can't mistake one for someone else, right?
Exactly.
And not just with the main characters, but also with just small walk-in bits, right? Background characters. So he does represent individuals in such a way with enough detail to where there's no way of mistaking one for another in his narrative. And I say that with a manga, speaking of manga, a manga creator in mind right now for me, and that is Naoki Urasawa. I've been doing a lot of reading of Urasawa lately. I recently wrapped up the Master Keaton series, and I've gotten into, I think, volume 4 now of Pluto. As much as I love Urasawa's work, his storytelling, and his art, and I love his art, there's something about Urasawa's style where at times when he draws individuals, he draws types. He doesn't draw individuals. Not every time, but sometimes. So the kind of, let's say, villain that enters his narrative, whether it be Monster or Master Keaton or Pluto or 20th Century Boys, they have a particular look. Or if there is a conniving or maybe a loose woman, she has a particular look. And so if not within the same series, you can definitely see a similarity of types or characters, facial features that he uses every now and again. And, that doesn't bother me, but I'm just mentioning this as a point of contrast to what we see in Davodeau in the way that he represents people in his narrative. I did say that it's not highly detailed, but again, it's detailed enough to where he makes distinctions between individuals.
Yeah, and I think it comes from his the way he approaches drawing and in his art of representing and designing characters. He doesn't work in a void. I mean, this is based on reality, so it's based on actual people he met. So there's a level of caricature in a way, in the good sense of the term, meaning drawing the people. Slightly cartoony, but not too much. But he actually mentioned that in Lulu Anu, his other book, which is fiction, there is a character of an old lady in the story, and he says, "That's my grandmother." that's the way she talks, that's the way she moves. So he's actually observing the real world a lot, and he's doing a lot of work, especially also with the settings. He takes pictures, and you can actually go, if you go to Angers, which is a small town in the west of France, and you can actually go there and find the streets that are shown in Lulu and Nu. You will actually recognize them. So he's very attached to that realism, but with a style that is very efficient. He doesn't get lost in small lines and all little details. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I think that's what makes him a very good storyteller and cartoonist in general.
Let's transition over to the other NBM title that we're discussing this month. And speaking of styles, this is vastly different, not only in terms of art, but in terms of story from what we've been discussing with Davodeau's The Initiates. And this is Satania. This is written by Fabien Vehlmann, and the art is by Kerascoët. And is that how you pronounce it?
Yes.
Kerascoët. Now, Kerascoët is actually a married couple, Marie Pompuy and Sébastien Cossé, correct? Is that how you pronounce their names?
Yeah, that's correct. Cossé, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I looked up right before we started recording, and Kerascoët actually comes from a small hamlet that one of them, maybe Cossé, had lived in at one point. And for whatever reason, they chose that as their joint name as artists.
It's a beautiful French Breton name, so maybe they're attached to that part of culture in the west of France. So yeah, it's a cool name.
It is. Now this is not the first Vehlmann and Kerascoët narrative that we've discussed on the Eurocomic series. Back in our episode January of last year, Edward and I, among other titles, looked at several works by Fabien Vehlmann, and I know on that show we looked at Clear Blue Tomorrow that he did with the artist Bruno Gazzotti, and I think we also discussed briefly the Alone series that he also does with Gazzotti, and we discussed Beautiful Darkness. Now, Beautiful Darkness is another joint work by Vehlmann and Kerascoët.
I just wanted to make a quick comment about because it's kind of an interesting connection. The Beautiful Darkness is actually one of the books that Davodeau asked Richard to read in The Initiates.
Oh, that's right. I'd forgotten about that.
So it's kind of a connection there.
See, had I remembered that, we could have used that as the segue.
Yeah, well,
thank you for bringing that up. I completely forgot that was the case. But I remember when I read that section, I thought, interesting, because we're going to be discussing Vehlmann and Kerascoët. How familiar are you with the work of both Vehlmann and Kerascoët?
So I have to say I'm more familiar with Vehlmann's writing. I've read several of his books and series. That was my first Kerascoët book. I actually have not read The Beautiful Darkness that they published, that Dorner Quarterly published. So that was kind of an introduction for me.
I've looked at some comics or BD where Kerascoët does the art. Obviously, Beautiful Darkness, which I read even before Edward and I decided to discuss that on that January 2017 show. But I also was familiar with some of Kerascoët's work with Hubert, Beauty, and then Miss Don't Touch Me, which I don't know if in France, but I think here it was published in 2 different volumes, but then NBM collected them into one. And I really did like both of those, Miss Don't Touch Me and then Beauty. Those were great works. But it's interesting that you haven't yet read Beautiful Darkness, because now you need to, because I want to get your reaction on Satania within the context of Beautiful Darkness, because now having read this new book, Satania, which came out in November of last year from NBM, it strikes me as very much like Beautiful Darkness without being too much like Beautiful Darkness. In other words, you have in this story the imaginative world in Satania that is similar, I think, to Beautiful Darkness, much more so than some of the narrative worlds that at least I'm familiar with other Vehlmann comics. For instance, the Alone series or Clear Blue Tomorrow. Yep. Those, as fantastical as they can be, are nonetheless anchored in a kind of reality that we all can recognize.
Yes.
Beautiful Darkness, yeah, it's anchored in a world we can recognize, but after a while, things kind of spin off in a certain direction where it does become... call it fantastical, I think, is an understatement, but Satania even more so.
That's definitely true. I think it speaks to maybe the nature of the collaboration is different. Vehlmann works with other artists that are maybe more grounded, even though he does sometimes sci-fi or historical things. But working with this team, I think they have a different type of collaborations. Definitely can see that.
Yeah, and there's something about, I think, the art of Kerascoët that, along with Vehlmann's writing, kind of gives, I guess, Vehlmann a license to go off into something that at times borders on the psychedelic. I couldn't help but think of Satania as, well, dreamlike is one word that comes to mind. But another term that occurred to me was fever dream.
Yeah, I can see that.
With what goes on. And I mean that in a good way, because I had a great time reading Satania. It is really wild. There's some strange things that go on. It gets kind of crazy. And I have to tell you, part of my experience in reading this, and I think maybe one of the reasons why I use the phrase fever dream, is I read this in not quite, but almost one sitting, and I finished it. Well, when I finished it, it was late at night, and I was very tired. But I wanted to get to the end of it, and so I can't put this book down until I finish it because I was so taken by the story. But I was extremely tired, and so my tiredness, I think, influenced my experience in reading and interpreting Satania. And I thought, wow, this is kind of weird and dreamlike, maybe like a fever dream. It's something that's weird and wacky. But I think even if I weren't tired, I would think of the story of Satania as weird and wacky.
Yeah, and I think the nature of the artwork, which is very on the surface, it looks like type of artwork you find in books for kids or for younger readers, and the type of colors they use, the characters being very cartoony and friendly looking. But I feel like Vehlmann is kind of wanting to exploit this and introducing ideas and stories that are completely in the other direction, that are much more adult in tone. So there is this constant strange feeling when you're reading it. Like, am I reading a Tintin or am I reading some strange, I don't know what it would be, Dante's Inferno or something?
Yeah. There is something Inferno-esque about this because there is a journey into the depths. And we can talk about that in a second. You know, what you've said reminds me of something that Edward and I pointed out back in January of last year when we looked at Beautiful Darkness, and that was the fact that Kerascoët's art, which does look rather childlike and innocent, is in some ways, in some places in the narrative, Beautiful Darkness, kind of turned on its head with the stark, at times, story elements of Vehlmann's writing. And so that strange juxtaposition, right? Something that looks cute and oriented for kids or a younger audience, is all of a sudden using this art in ways that bring home really dark and kind of gross things
content,
at times. Right. I mean, I remember one particular scene in Beautiful Darkness, where you have a series of small people.
Yes.
And one of the little people, a young girl, gets lost, and she finds her way to a bird's nest. And she's hungry. She hasn't had a lot to eat. She's lost. And she notices that the chicks in the nest are opening their mouth for the mother to give them bits of a worm. And so she opens her mouth so she can get something to eat. And the bird inserts her beak with the worm into the little girl's mouth. But when she does so, the beak punctures her palate and kills her.
Wow.
It's gross, right? And so you have this cute art with a rather dark and gross image. And there's some similar things going on, I think, in Satania.
Yeah, I think there's, you mentioned the word journey, and I think going back to the original title and the theme of the book, the original title is Voyage en Satanie, right? Which echoes Voyage au centre de la Terre, which is the French title of Journey to the Center of the Earth, the Jules Verne's book. And I think basically the Satania's story is Journey to the Center of the Earth, right? It's the same journey they're taking, going down in the caves and exploring, but the purpose is to prove the existence of hell, which makes it quite different from the Jules Verne book. But so I think from the beginning, with that echo in the title, as a French reader, when I look at the title, I'm thinking about Jules Verne, which is not subversive. Right. It's actually quite didactic and safe to read for young readers, of course. So there's kind of like this. There's this kind of a game and kind of perversion going on there, which fits with the theme of the book, definitely.
Right. And we should mention that in this work as well, Joe Johnson is the translator.
Yes.
Yes. Now, the story of Satania, and you were getting to some of that just a moment ago. It starts off as relatively straightforward, right? So at the very beginning, we're introduced to this character who he's obviously in a cave of some sort. And he has I don't know if you call it a spelunker's hat, but it's a hard hat with a light on it, right? And this guy, we find out later that he is a priest. His name is Father Mansour. Is that, you pronounce it Mansour?
Yeah, it's a very strange name. I mean, it's Mansour, I guess. Okay, it's unusual, yeah.
Okay, so Father Mansour, and he is a little on the grumpy side when we first see him, and he makes his way to a group of men, and he's basically saying, "What the hell are you doing here? You know, you should have been back." Now, we don't know exactly why they're down there, at least at first, or how long they've been down there, but they point the priest to another direction where Lavergne, is that how you pronounce his name?
Lavergne, yeah.
Lavergne, where Lavergne is, and of course we're wondering who's Lavergne, and then the father goes there. Lavergne seems to be the one who's the passion behind this expedition, and we learn in bits and pieces that they're down there looking for someone named Christopher. That Christopher came down there, was lost, and so they're looking for him. Now, we have no idea for a good part of this narrative why Christopher went underground, and thus why everyone is trying to find him. Now, part of this expedition, the search party, is Christopher's sister, Charlotte, or she's called Charlie throughout most of the story. And so they're looking for Christopher, but over time, as the narrative unfolds, and this is one of the things I really appreciate about Vehlmann's writing, is that he doesn't throw tons of exposition at the very beginning. He doesn't vomit it out. We get little bits and pieces here or there that we're able to put together to make a more coherent story world. So it may be about halfway through this book that things really start coming together. We learn apparently, and this is not a spoiler in any means, but we learned that Christopher went underground because he had certain theories about creatures, individuals, or some kind of beings who may have journeyed underground like centuries and eons ago, and they have evolved in such a way that now we call them something other than human. It may be what we're referring to when we talk about Satan and hell. But he has these kind of wild theories, and so we learn bits and pieces here or there. That's how and why, I guess, Christopher went underground. They didn't hear from him, and so they sent a search party after him, including his sister Charlotte, who's very close and attached to him. She has issues of her own. And in fact, if I were going to put my finger on a protagonist of Satania, it would have to be Charlie.
Yeah, I agree with that. And she's also featured on the cover, right? So, but to go back to what you were talking about, the not having a lot of information when we start reading, and it's just, I was looking, it's on page 22 that we learn about the theories. So it takes a while before we get there. And I was wondering, because I read the little summary at the back before reading, because the way, I'm reading from PDF, and the actual back of the book is featured, that's page number 2. It's kind of odd, but so there's a little summary, right, that actually talks about the reason Christopher is underground and exploring the center of the earth. And I don't know if it qualifies as a spoiler, but I was wondering if I had not read that, I think the effect would have been even stranger, right? The reading experience would have been more unsettling, because I was expecting, it's like, when are they going to talk about this? And I had to go through 20 pages before they mention it.
See, this is one of the great things about doing a show like this, discussing comics with a co-host, because you can get different experiences. I can speak to what you were just wondering about. What would it have been had you not read that blurb on the back? I didn't read the blurb on the back until after I finished the book.
Ah, okay.
And so my experience with this narrative was a bit different from yours, in that I didn't know what to expect, not having read the back of the book. And so that's why I was pointing out just a moment ago that Vehlmann lets out little bits of his premise here and there. But you're right. I hadn't thought about that blurb on the back of the book, and it may not officially be a spoiler, but it does kind of spoil things to some degree.
Yes, it does. Because it really, and that's.
And so by talking about it on this podcast, I guess we've engaged in spoilers. In a way.
I think the by announcing the concept, this book is a concept book, right? I feel like Vehlmann got this idea of, let's explain demons and then demon creatures in a different way, in a way that is Darwinian, as opposed to maybe purely based on religious belief.
Right.
And I can imagine,
scientific, not theological.
Correct. And I can imagine Vehlmann going, "Oh, that's I want to do that. That's an interesting idea. So how do I tackle this?" And it's a great idea. And I think it's also maybe the limit of the book, in a way, that it's a constraint that he's trying to get there, but he doesn't want to make it too much of an expose. So he doesn't tell us, and then there's like a little, like you said, little bits of information here and there. To me, there are limits to how it actually works. If it achieves the goal it is announcing. And maybe it's unfair to have that blurb in the back. Maybe it shouldn't be there.
No, I definitely agree with you about the blurb on the back part. If they do have a blurb on the back of this book, then it should have been something else. But it does point out, and this gets back to what we were talking about in terms of, let's say Christopher's original intentions, going down there because he wants to try to prove his theory. And you're right, this is much more of a Darwinian or scientific approach to what we kind of loosely call the underworld or hell or devils or what have you, than a more theologically based one. But what that also does in Vehlmann's story is, and I think this is part of the subtext here, it points out the fact that, this kind of good and evil, this more religious-based understanding of ethics is really inaccurate, and it's definitely not empathetic, because if indeed this, what we call devils, or I guess what in the books are called Satanians, residents of this underworld realm, if they used to be human, or if there's something human-like about them, then what does that say about us? And what does that say about our conception of evil? Along with that, and I don't want to give out anything that's an overt spoiler, but at one point in the story, Charlie has an experience with the Satanians that has her not only wondering about the humans or the above-worlders, if we want to call them those, relationship with what they're calling the Satanians, but it also has her thinking about a relationship with her mother. Because as Satania, the book, unfolds, we learn, again, in bits and pieces here and there, what Charlotte had growing up, especially her relationship with her mother. We don't get much of a relationship with her brother, but definitely with her mother. And that tells us a lot about how Charlie does what she does, or why she does what she does, or why she's the person that she seems to be to us as readers. Yeah, I think that the encounters, or one in particular that she has with the Satanians, are quite telling. But it gets back to this whole idea of a more Darwinian approach to what we call or look at something like it's devilish or evil.
Yeah, and he seems to include the idea that, he uses the Darwinian evolution idea, but sped up, right? So they actually evolve faster.
Yeah.
But that's also the case for our characters, who are, their journey is changing them to something else or someone else at a very fast pace in the story, where and I think that goes back to the point you were making about where is this ethics or evilness, if you want, where does it come from? Is it the demons themselves, or is it the actual journey that reveals things? See what I'm getting at with that? Right. So I like the way this is done in as you're reading the book. There is this change that happens in all characters, and sometimes it is very unsettling because the changes are very surprising, or they don't. Right? They don't seem to make sense. They don't seem logical. I don't know if you had that experience too while you were reading.
Oh, yeah. Well, like I said, I read this. I finished it late at night, and so I was already tired to begin with. So things seemed, I think, especially illogical to me in the state that I first read this. But, you're right. And I think part of that experience, and I think it was meant to be that way, it strikes me that there are other narratives that do similar things, and they're doing it for, I guess you could say, primarily psychological reasons. So I couldn't help but think of Richard Wright's short story, The Man Who Lived Underground.
Okay.
I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's an incredible story. I remember the first time I read The Man Who Lived Underground and the experiences that this man had when he was underground. I thought, okay, this is not a realistic narrative. This is very fantastical, very imaginative. But it was actually, it was a realistic narrative. But it was represented, the story was told in such a way that it's like the man going into his own psyche, right? So it's like an inner journey into the self. And that's how I was looking at Satania, that it is a journey underground, beneath the earth, so to speak. But it's also a journey that goes into the interior of a psyche.
Yeah, and I think it's all connected to, it's very claustrophobic, right? The entire book, or I guess 99% has like one page that's outside, right? I think everything else is underground. There's like one flashback page, right?
Right.
Basically, pretty much. So yeah, the characters being completely disconnected from the day-night cycle, and of course, as an effect, and that's what you were talking about, the accounts of people who actually experience the being isolated, underground for long periods of time, where the natural body clock is completely modified, and the way of thinking, the way you appreciate that time is a construct, because it doesn't apply anymore when you are in that darkness, isolated from the natural cycle of the sun, etc. And that can generate psychological troubles and issues, definitely. So I can see that in there, kind of represented in the story.
Yeah. Okay. Let me ask you something else that I'm curious your take on this. And again, I don't want to give out too much information because we don't want to give away too many spoilers, but I'm wondering what you thought about how this story ended. What I mean by that is, and this is a book that's not in chapters, right?
No.
But we have what at first I thought was the end of this narrative. And this is basically everything that Charlie has gone through up to the very end. And then we have, it's two completely black pages after that. And then we have something that I would call a coda, if you will, which follows things up at a particular time after. And again, I don't want to give away too much. And it's only about, 2-3 pages, something like that.
Yeah, 2 pages, yeah.
Yeah. I'm okay with this ending. I wonder how the narrative would have felt, though, without that very last part that I'm calling a coda.
Yeah, I felt like it was a bit of we don't want to spoil anything, but there's maybe a reveal or something that as a reader, I didn't really, it made me go back and say, wait a minute, did I miss something? Definitely. And it also functioned a little bit as a mirror of the opening sequence. That's what I saw in it in terms of the setting. It seems that it's almost the beginning of another journey in a way, a different one.
Yeah.
So I could see that, but I felt that there was a little ta-da, a little twist that was not really, I was not expecting that from this type of narrative, that it would be, because it's very, although it takes you to strange places, you follow the red thread, right? It's a line, it's going down to the center of the earth and the psyche. So I thought it was a fitting image before we get to the black pages, the very last panel of page 124, where she's following that red thread, which is a recurring theme through the book. But then it starts again. In a way, right? Yeah,
and you mentioned the red thread, which is like a recurring visual leitmotif. We should point out that her hair is a very bright red, and she even comments about her very red hair and how that marked her in not necessarily all good ways when she was a little girl.
Yes.
It also tells us something, again, without giving too much away, something about her relationship with her mother and what her mother was known for, at least in her eyes, and why, or maybe why, she ends up doing some of the things, Charlie, that happens in the story that we have. Yeah.
Yeah, and another thing that I appreciate about the book is the way they decided on a very dense layout in terms of numbers of panels. Sometimes we have up to like 13 or 12 panels per page.
Right.
And so I think that it doesn't make the story denser in terms of information, but it creates that sense of, I feel trapped in this little boxes, There's so much visual information sometimes, and sometimes quite a bit of text.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, some of that does add to the claustrophobia that you had mentioned early on, right? Of being underground. Also, we're dealing with, again, a journey. And so there is movement going from one place to another. And I think that when you have more panels per page, there is more of a sense of physical movement.
Correct. Yes. From place. Yes. From inside the space. Yeah.
Yeah. So instead of having a page with either 4 or 6 or 9 panels, you have a page with 12 or something like that. And it does suggest more rapidity, more movement, but at the same time, especially if those panels are angular, and they not always are, then that does give a sense of confinedness and claustrophobia that you had mentioned earlier.
Yeah, it's fairly grid-like throughout. There are a few instances where it's not, and it kind of disrupts this for good reasons in the story. So I think that the way they use their layouts is, I think, very effective in conveying a sense when there's a crisis or they are completely changing the setting to something very fantastical or unusual. And suddenly the panel structure is completely different. I'm thinking about page 56, for example, where they enter this strange crystal, I don't know what to call it, crystal field, maybe?
Right.
Mm-hmm. And it actually reminded me that the density and the journey and the constant movement reminded me of Hayao Miyazaki's Nausicaa manga. Have you read that? Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind?
No, I haven't.
So the central character is also a young woman, and there are different factions, and it's very dense. There are a lot of small panels, and it's constantly moving, going from one place to another. And plus, it has. I wouldn't be surprised if they have read it, because there are like huge insects, like kind of scary-looking insect monsters, and it's about. It's also about changes in nature and what you consider what is bad and good in nature, like what is the evil force, what is the force for good, and you realize that they are the one and the same, and those things intersect, and you cannot say this is good, this is bad. It's all mixed together, but yeah, if you haven't read that, it's a masterpiece. It's amazing. Yeah. You should give it a try. It's a big one though.
Yeah. Another example of a different kind of panel layout, visually speaking, occurs on pages 82 and 83. This is later in the story when, at least at this point, Charlie and Father Monsieur are the only two members that we see, and they find a place where they can at least temporarily make camp.
Yes.
Or at least Charlie wants it to be temporary. But the pages in question, 82 and 83, you go from, let's say, the previous pages where you do have a more traditional grid layout to panels that are this strange amorphous shape in one way or another.
Yes.
On those 2 pages. This, interestingly enough, is an occasion where, at least momentarily, we get the story told from the perspective of Father Monsieur keeping a journal. And so the information that we get primarily, not exclusively, over these 2 pages are entries from Father Monsieur's journal. And so that kind of occasional flowing memory way of telling a story is, I think, brought out by these really strangely amorphously shaped panels.
Yeah, definitely the layout is mirroring the change in the narrative approach. And I honestly, when I was reading, when I got to this point, I was a little worried about this turn, that using the diary entries suddenly out of the blue, when it's never been established that the character is actually keeping a diary.
Yeah, it seems strange.
Yeah, and there's a pause that they are actually not. Yeah, the pause in their journey, they're actually settling somewhere, so that the rhythm of their daily life is different. So yes, time, I guess, to write down what's happening. But at the same time, the characters are, not moving anymore, but the story and the information we get pushes the narrative faster, I felt, in this, right? Because he's kind of I don't want to say info dumping, but he's feeding us information. This is happening. And the panels are not sequential anymore. I mean, not as much. They're still a little bit sequential, but they kind of jump to different times, right? Like this is what we did at one point, and then, and I was wondering what brought Vehlmann to do that at this point, and I
don't know. That's a good question.
And I was wondering if it has to do. We kind of mentioned this briefly when we discussed the book. I mean, off mic. This book has a strange publishing history in France because it was published in one volume in 2011. I mean, the first half of the story, and it was not successful. So Dargaud, the initial publisher, dropped it, and it found a new home at Soleil, which is another major publisher in France. And then they finished it, and it was published as a one volume in 2016 in France. So there must have been a time where they must have stopped working on it, because it's 5 years, right?
Right.
So, and I was wondering if going back to it, he had to change things a little bit to make it fit, so it wouldn't be too long, because it's how long is this? It's over like 130 or 120 pages.
Right.
So this is complete speculation, but when I got to this point, I was wondering, wow, what's happening here? Is it because of the publishing history? But I also feel that because they got, as a team, cartoonist and writer team, they didn't let it go. Right? They try to find a new home and to finish the story. It shows that it was very important to them, right? They could have moved on to a different project, but they did not. So I appreciate that they went, they wrapped up their story, and they really finished what they had to say about it. So
right. Now, it's interesting also that, these 2 pages that we're discussing, 82 and 83, where you do have, I pointed out the shift in panels, you underscored the sense that we have a shift in narration style. One thing that's also significant about this section is that after this point, like at the very end of page 83 onward, we get a different Charlie.
Yes.
Now, granted, more time has passed to where she has, physically and psychologically grown more. She's experienced more, but she has come into her own more, and she definitely does mature in every sense of the word.
Yes.
Because not only does she seem more, cognitively and psychologically grown up, but also she's physically grown. We see her naked. Now,
yes.
She has, something over her her bottom part, but she is bare-breasted, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at one point, I think even, Father Mansour says, "And cover yourself, young lady."
Mm-hmm.
But basically she has, I don't want to say gone native, but, it's hot down there, or it's warmer than it is up above. And so she's doing this out of necessity. But also, what's the need of wearing the kind of clothes that she would wear up above?
Yeah.
So it makes sense that she is mostly naked from this point forward. One of the things that does is, and the art of Kerascoët doesn't, I don't think it really sexualizes the character Charlie, but it does show that she has grown. Although I will say, and again, I don't want to go into too much detail, that it's right after this scene that we're discussing that she has that aforementioned encounter with the Satanians, or at least one Satanian, that tells us quite a bit.
True. And I also, kind of thinking about your comment on her, changing her appearance and clothing, she's actually gone through a change before, because when they go through that strange ultimate tool, I don't want to pronounce it, ultimate tool, underground city, she has to wear the special outfit to protect herself from the elements. And there's a lot in the story about, and actually two people enter wear it at the same time, because they lose one, right? Those protective suits.
Oh, that's right.
I feel
two of them inhabit one. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel, to me, it's a little bit like this. The stages of a change in an insect, right? The pupa, larva. There's like this kind of, the character changes and is born again every time. They change their costume and the layers, and especially that strange protective suit is almost like a womb, and then they come out of it at some point.
It's interesting that you point this out, because as you're talking now, I'm flipping through the book and looking at other instances where this may be the case, where it does look like that she's changed physically in how she's represented by the artists. There are other occasions in this narrative where you do have other characters who go through some kind of transformation. Yes. And they're not just talking about psychological transformation, physical transformation. There's something that happens toward the end with Charlie's brother Christopher.
Yes.
That is very transformative. And to me, that's when things got the most freaky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like the last stage of transformation, right?
Yes.
And there's one small translation comment that I don't really understand why, but the character of Christopher in the French version is called Constantin. And I don't understand why they changed his name, Constantine, right? Maybe it was because of Hellblazer, but it doesn't have an E at the end. It's the French spelling. But I was surprised that they changed his name. Or is it because they wanted to have... But because Christopher includes, Christ in his name, which would bring other layers of meaning. I don't know about Constantin, but so I was surprised about the other characters have their original names. He's the only one who has a different name.
Now, had you originally read this in French?
No, but I went on. I read it in English, and I looked up information about it on French websites, and they kept talking about Constantin. I was like, who is this character? So I pulled up a few pages in French, and I realized, oh, okay, they just changed his name. So, and that's how I found out. And I don't really understand why they did that.
Well, definitely a different kind of story from where we started with the Initiates.
Definitely. And I'm wondering about the audience, the readership for this. I think they say 17 plus on the back of the book?
Yeah, it would have to be that. It's very much, as I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion of Satania, it just reminds me a lot of Beautiful Darkness, in that on the surface, it looks like something for younger readers, but there are more complicated, darker, and potentially more disturbing things going on in the narrative that a more mature reader, I think, is called for this book, Satania.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's kind of also an unusual, maybe, choice for NBM, but why not?
And why not?
Yes.
Well, Pascal, we looked at 2 NBM books on the March episode of the Eurocomic series. We started off with Étienne Davodeau's The Initiates, and then we looked at Fabien Vehlmann and Kerascoët's Satania. 2 very different books,
Yes.
but both published by NBM and both very enjoyable.
Yes, you can get a lot from those 2 books, even though they're so different.
Yes.
But great experiences, yeah.
Right. And we want to thank the good people at NBM for helping us out and making sure that we had review copies. They do a really good job, not only with the kind of books that they put out, but with helping us out at the Comics Alternative, whether it be, our Eurocomic series or our weekly review shows. In particular, thanks Stefan for being the contact person and keeping in touch with us. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, and for being so responsive and quick when I came on board unannounced. And they just sent me all the copies. I didn't have to do anything. So great stuff. Thank you.
Well, Pascal, we're wrapping up right now, your very first episode. How does it feel to be on the other side of a podcast, in front of a mic?
It's an interesting experience. It's like a journey to the center of the earth.
Or the depths of hell, if you want to look at it that way.
Exactly. No, I hope people will enjoy the episode, and that give me feedback if you have any comments. I'm here to learn as well. I'm an ignorant when it comes to podcasting, right? So please initiate me.
We'll learn ya.
Yes.
And if you want to learn about great books like the kind that Pascal and I have been discussing, then definitely head over to the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. As Pascal pointed out at the top of the show, you can find quite a number of NBM titles at great discounts. So check those out at dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought of the first outing with Pascal. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or you can email us at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. Or if you want to email me directly, you can email me at pascal@comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, YouTube, Pinterest, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. A lot of ways for people to get in touch with us. And again, we do like to hear from you. So whether it be via Facebook or email or whatever means, let us hear what you thought about the monthly Eurocomic show.
Let us know.
That's right.
Thank you.
And Pascal and I will be back next month with more comics fun. Until then, I'm Derek.
I'm Pascal.
See you later.
Au revoir.
Thank you.